Aren't we punctual? My goodness, 8:56 and everyone is seated. If we keep this up, we'll knock off early today. That's incredible. Oh no, here we go, some stragglers. Well, on time. Come in, you're welcome. You wouldn't believe how many conferences I've been to and somebody's walking around with a bell saying, come on, get in. It really speaks to the quality, doesn't it, of what we're anticipating to learn today at the 16th annual conference of the perennial pasture systems. So, welcome everyone. Some housekeeping for a start. Phones. Beautiful, you get it. Rightio, so silent or off. As you walked in, you would have seen the sponsors for the day. So please make yourself known to the sponsors. It's a big deal for the sponsors. This time of year, there's a lot going on. There's plenty of these days going on. So to come and set up and contribute to the success of the day is a big deal. So, I really do encourage you to, just pull away from that really in-depth chat that you're having about who's going to win the football and go and catch up with someone and talk about something that might increase your farm productivity. So that's good. Then we've got the ongoing sponsors that support us through the whole year, and you'll see the likes of Rabobank and CMAs, etc., that really contribute to the overall success of PPS and the work that we do for the members. Now, what have we got here next on the list, because I've strayed a little bit. Thanks to Tess for the IT and the helpers at the front desk. How smooth was that? Grant said as we were walking in, he said, gee whiz, normally there's a line out the door. What's going on this year? And so hopefully everybody found the system nice and easy to use. Tim, Duncan, Sue for the town hall for the assistance. Thank you. Now, toilets. They'll become important at some stage during the day. So toilets near the entrance, follow the signs, and emergency exits are the ones that we hope that we don't have to use at any stage, and they're either out the side or out the front. Filming and photos. So Sarah's down here at the front. If you've got any issues with photos being taken of you, please catch up with Sarah. The President's report is in the book here, so there's lots of good things to read in that book. Now, the speakers have put in a lot of preparation with their talks, and part of that is leaving time to have some good questions. So, I think that most or all of the speakers will do their presentations and then take questions at the end, so there'll be plenty of time. There's been plenty of time scheduled to do that. So I think Rabo have included a pen in the satchel. We've got room in the book to make notes. So, as the speakers are speaking, make plenty of notes and do that. Sinead hasn't included anything in that little run sheet there about herself. But I think it's important that we point out that, Sinead's taken this on for the first season. Last year at the AGM, we were talking about looking for somebody new. And if you've been getting PPS correspondence, you would have seen in the newsletters, etc., that we've got a project manager in Sinead. And so this is her first conference, and so far so good, Sinead, so well done. That's cool. We'll just stay out of your way and let you do it and not muck it up for you. So, good. How are we going? We're well ahead of time. Cool. Well, in the interest of having plenty of Q&A time, let's kick off the first session. So, look, the topic for the first session is, some things change, some things stay the same, reflecting on 40 years of livestock production in the southwest Victoria. The speakers, as you probably have already read in the program, is Cam Nicholson from Nicon Rural Services. Now, we probably are all know Cam to some degree, but just for those of you who may not, Cam Nicholson's a director of Nicon Rural Services near Geelong. With over 35 years' experience, Cam has been involved with MLA, GRDC, Land Care and Future Drought Fund. He lectures at Marcus Oldham College and runs a 400-hectare beef and merino wool farm with his wife Fiona on the Bellarine Peninsula. His work spans soil fertility, grazing systems and farm business risk management, and is a national leader in climate resilience and carbon accounting. So with that, I'd like you to welcome Cam to the lectern.
Thanks, Craig, and good morning, everybody. When I was asked to give this talk, or invited to give this talk by Sinead and Rob, I didn't know if it meant that I was really, really old, because I could remember 40 years back and had 40 years experience, or there was some other motive. But what I've tried to do, and it's actually the first time I've actually had to try and think, what was it like 40 years ago when I started, and I started in the Ag Department in Victoria, and what's changed over time. Things that we take for granted now and we just do as routine was actually big at the time, it was new at the time. So what I'm trying to do is use my memory to cast back and sort of think these are the changes that really have been profound in the way we operate our farming system. And it might be slightly different to the way you remember it, so apologies if that's the case. And here we go. All right, I want to start in the pre-80s. So I started in 85 in the Department of Ag in Victoria. And when we started off, the Ag Department was the source of information. I remember when I started in Kerrang, in our office that we had there, they had a library. And in the library, I remember walking in the first day, and in the library, they had this journal that was produced by the Victorian Department of Agriculture every month. It was actually circulated all around the country. You could subscribe to it, and people used to buy it overseas. And it was the source of information and knowledge. And it went back to early 1900s, 1911 I think is when it started. And so there were these monthly journals that were put out. There was also a picture that looked like this. Anybody recognise what that is? That was called the Better Farming Train. And it used to chuff around the countryside in Victoria, and all the carriages were filled with the latest information and the latest ways and the most technology on how you farm. And it's fascinating. If you actually look at the carriages inside, it had varieties. It talked about things like fertiliser. It was really quite a fascinating source of information. But that was the source of information. It was the Ag Department, the Victorian Department of Agriculture. And it was like that up until the late 70s, early 80s. But then things started to change. And I just came in on the tail end of that change. So what we found was different. The first one that I want to reflect on is this idea about the services and the information and where we get them from. So when I first started, as I said, it was the Ag Department, but as I moved in, there was a few discussions that were going on. The first one was around this idea of what we call public versus private good. Because up until then, a lot of the information that was being provided by the Ag Department was being provided free of charge. And I remember when I first started in the Ag Department, I could go out and do a farm visit and didn't have to charge anything. Farmer would ring up, wanted some information, you'd go out and visit them and you'd provide that information. But in government, they were saying, hang on a tick, you're getting a private benefit out of this based on someone that's being paid by the public purse. Maybe we've got to change that model. And it did start to change. And I was just at that point, and in fact, it was one of the reasons why I got out of the Ag Department and went private, because I enjoyed that one-to-one consulting, and the Ag Department was pulling back from that. So that was the first one. The second one then was around user pays. And we started to introduce some things where you had to pay for the information. You had to pay for access to certain things. I remember holding field days where no one paid, everybody just turned up. In fact, I remember sitting in the tea room in my first year there, and our office had an allocation to do research. And we sat round and we decided what research we'd do. In fact, we had a staff. We had 3 farm workers, had our trucks, had the tractors, had all that sort of stuff, and we would decide each year what trials we'd run. Didn't have to apply for grants or projects or any of that sort of stuff. It was just there and you could just do it. The job's obviously fairly different now, and this user pay model came into it. And the third one was around this idea of these collaborations and partnerships. Instead of the Ag Department being the font of knowledge, and in the soil erosion side of it was the Soil Conservation Authority. And I remember when I was going through university doing projects with the Soil Conservation Authority, where they'd come onto your farm and they'd build structures because you had erosion. It's all very different now. But those 3 things changed in my early days in the Ag Department. And so we had these sort of things that occurred. People who remember the Landcare start, that was 86. And that was really one of the first models, I think, of where we had that partnership, where it was sort of ground up. It was what did the locals want to do, what were the issues we wanted to deal with, and trying to do that in collaboration or in partnership. These organisations now, the RDCs, that everybody thinks, that's, RDCs have always been there. They take levies from us when they do project work, or they have resources that can be invested in the projects. They didn't exist in the early 80s. It was actually 1989 when they came into being. So MLA, GRDC, all those people didn't exist before that. So there was this model the federal government said is if you put some money in, we'll put some money in as well. And that's the model that still works now. But that was new, and it changed the focus of where's the resourcing coming from to actually pay for some of the work that we do. We then had farming groups start. Southern Farming Systems, I was with their 30-year anniversary only a couple of weeks ago, Chatsworth House. BCG started before that, so that was sort of 1992, 1995 era when the farming systems groups started up, and 30 years later they're still ticking along. We had things like Best Wool, Best Lamb, that's 1998. And then couldn't leave this one out, seeing as you invited me to be here. Anybody remember when PPS started? 2007, beautiful. Who was that? Oh, beautiful, 2007, yeah. So you could see that sort of evolution from what was government-run, government sourcing information, government providing information, to a much different model now of where we get our services and where we get our information from. And a lot of these partnerships, like the perennial pasture systems, like the Southern Farming Systems and things like that, collaboration now between commercial, farmers and departments. But there was one difference. There was one partnership model that was occurring before that. Anybody like to guess what it might be? It started in 1959. Anybody want to have a crack? Grasslands. Thank you, Ken. Oh, you're old enough to remember, aren't you, Ken? Beautiful. You and I together. All right. It was called the Grassland Society of Victoria. It's actually the Grassland Society of Southern Australia now because of amalgamation of a few states. But that actually started in 1959. And when you look at the history of where that started, it was beautiful. They organised a meeting, or called a meeting. It was in the week when the show was on in Melbourne, so in September. So everybody that was coming to the show could then go to this inaugural meeting. It was held at the University of Melbourne in Parkville, at the Ag School there in Melbourne. And they started up the Grassland Society. The reason why I wanted to highlight this one is this partnership model came up with a project which I reckon just revolutionised the way we've thought in the last 40 years about doing big projects. And that was what was called the Pasture Productivity Program, or the Triple P program. Anybody remember that? Stick your hand up if you've got some vague inclination of what Triple P was. Okay. Triple P was the first in what I'll talk about as 4 pillars that I think have redesigned our modern grazing system as what we use now. And the Pasture Productivity Program was based on some work that was being done at PVI in Hamilton, where they were putting increasing rates of fertiliser on, phosphorus fertiliser in particular, and getting greater growth and therefore being able to run more stock. And people looked at this and thought, I wonder if this works in other places rather than just Hamilton. So the Triple P program was designed where you took a paddock, you split it in half, you put more fertiliser on one side, you put your normal, what was traditional practice on the other side, and you ran stock on it. And the one that had more fertiliser on it, believe it or not, could run more stock. So you could up your stocking rate. So it was set stocked, but it was set stocked. And first of all, we realised there was a difference between the targets that we'd had for phosphorus. And I actually delved back to my Notes that I got when I first started in the ag department, an Olsen P of 8 was considered good and an Olsen P of 12 was considered really, really high. Okay. We learnt from this that in fact you could go much higher, and we learnt this idea that fertiliser grows fat leaves. Okay. It doesn't make them pop out any faster, but it actually makes them bigger. So you put more fertiliser on, you grow more product, and guess what? You can run more stock as part of that. And we also refined some of these response curves of understanding at different levels of phosphorus level, what sort of production you could sort of get. It's a super important change from where we were when I first started. And I call that pillar 1, okay, of our modern grazing system. And the Triple P program should take real credit for doing that. That was the first of those partnership projects that made something that was really, really different. We take for granted now. You go, you get a soil test, I need a phosphorus level of sort of around about 15 or whatever else to get production. We just, that's what we aim for, that's what we do. It's just accepted. But in fact, that was a big change at the time. The second one was this one, Sustainable Grazing Systems and their delivery program associated with that, which was ProGraze. Anybody heard of those names and terms? Yeah, I'm sure you would have, because this was about 1996 is when this came out. Now, the difference with ProGraze, or what ProGraze advanced as far as where we were going from, and I should say there was also in parallel a private group operating, Terry McCosker, in grazing for profit, but it was based on the same and what I call the second pillar or the second principle. And that was this idea about understanding that when you graze a plant, it uses its reserves to regrow its new leaves, and it needs a period of spelling to recover, to basically recharge its fuel tank so it can do the same thing again. This is where we actually learnt this idea about grazing and spelling. Because up until then, my recollection is that most paddocks were set stocked. In fact, I remember when I was doing work experience, and I did quite a lot in bull sheds at different times, it wouldn't be uncommon to bring the 4-year-old wethers in from a paddock. They would get shorn, they would get drenched, and they'd go back in their paddock for the year. And then you brought the 3-year-old wethers in, and the same thing, and they'd go back to their paddock. Okay, so they were set stocked for the year. So this idea of grazing and spelling, mobs getting bigger, forgetting about age, mobs getting bigger, and then moving them around and giving plants the ability to recover and replenish their reserves was something that was new. And there was a lot of work done in the SGS program to fully understand this and fully understand not only what it does above ground but below ground. And so this little picture here, that's a plant there that's been grazed at the 1-leaf stage on numerous occasions, compared to this one here that's been grazed at the 3-leaf stage where that plant has been able to recover its reserves. And so it's changed the root system below the ground, it's also changed the productivity above the ground. And when you put this one together with the one around the fertiliser, if fertiliser grows fat leaves and this gives us an opportunity to grow leaves because we're not eating them all the time, we've got a fundamental shift in the amount of production that we actually get out of our pastures. I reckon most people now would do some form of grazing and spelling in their pastures. I'd be surprised if you would find anybody that would leave animals in a paddock for 6 months, 12 months at a time. Periods of lambing and calving might be a little bit different, but they're only for short periods and then the pasture gets spelled. Wasn't that way 35 years ago. Okay, so this is actually a profound change. This is what I call pillar 2. Okay, this idea of grazing management came in. So soil nutrition, plant nutrition, and then grazing management. You put those two together, big shift, big step forward. The third one then was Evergraze, and Evergraze, I've got my notes here, 2003 when this one came in. People probably be more familiar with Evergraze as part of that. And their catchphrase was putting the right plant in the right place for the right purpose with the right management. And so this one was very much a focus of which species fits where. What fits best in the system to maximise the rainfall we get and maximise the type of operation we're trying to run. And I've got a little thing there, semi-winter active lucerne in one part of the farming system, you've got perennial ryegrass in another one, you've got summer active tall fescues in another one, is their example there. But basically it put a focus on species. And knowing that species were different And if we could make the right sort of blend of those species in the right paddocks where they wanted to grow, rather than trying to push them in the paddocks that they didn't want to grow, we'd actually make an advance. That worked incredibly well. And I don't reckon you'd see many farms now that we put everything in the one mix, we all sow it at once, okay, and we sow it on every paddock. Okay? We have different species in different parts of the pasture. I look back at my old notes on what we'd recommend for pasture sowing when I was up in Kerrang, and you stuck a bit of everything in because something might grow. Okay, so you put it all together. We don't sort of do that now. We're far more selective because we understand the species better. And that's what I call pillar 3. And then the last one, which was something that was close to my heart, grain and graze, that also started in 2003. I was in fact involved with this for 17 years in the different iterations of it. That was the mixed farming bit. And I'll mention in a tick how cropping has actually changed the landscape in this part of the world. But this idea of being able to integrate a farming system, not only with crop and livestock, but just the way we integrate our livestock system, made a difference. And that's what I call the 4 pillars. So if you put them together, we actually learnt these 4 things. This is in my time in agriculture, is we've now learnt, you know what to plant, you know how to graze them, you know how to feed them. And I've got feeding the plants, but also feeding the animals as well, which I'll touch on in a tick because I think we've made some big advances with that. And we've learned how to put the system together better. So those 4 have just been some, what I'd call step changes in the way we operate. And if you want to see the impact on that, I reckon the best one to look at is what's changed in stocking rate. So I went back to the Southwest Monitor Farm project, which people will probably be familiar with. That started in 1970. And it was actually collecting real farm data from farmers each year about what they did. It wasn't passing any judgment on it, it was just collecting that data. And it's an amazing data set when you start to go back now 50 years to see what's changed. I only went back 30 years because that was enough. But if you look at stocking rate from 1990, which was a time when I was talking about that some of these changes were occurring, to where we sort of are now, that's how our stocking rates changed. So we were bubbling on when these programs started around about that sort of 11 DSE a hectare mark, and we're up around about that 16 DSE mark now. It's pretty big. That's pretty big. Okay? And it's not a once-off. As you can see, we're doing it consistently. So we've actually become far more productive, if you like, per hectare in the way we operate our systems. What underpins that are those 4 pillars that I mentioned before. The other one that I've seen that's a profound shift is this idea around enterprise mix. I'll just put this up, same monitor farm data, so just for Southwest Victoria. This is how, if we just look at the sheep side of the operation, how it's changed over that period, over that 30-year period, or 25-year period, where mid-90s were around about 10%, if you like, were meat sheep, and about 65-70% were wool sheep, and you can see it's the exact opposite now. As Rob Shea said to me, all we're doing now, people who've got wool is just, they've only got wool to keep the meat warm. You know, it's not that they're actually, it's a very different system to where we're operating now. And I think part of that has also enabled us to focus a lot more on the animal production and the feeding side of it. You could get away with things with wool sheep as far as feeding goes. Haven't got the same flexibility there when you're starting to look at meat sheep and trying to turn that off in kilos of carcass weight. But that's a big change. And then if you put over the top of that where the beef side of it is, that's bounced around at around about that 20% in Southwest Victoria. Now this comes from monitor farm data, so it's very much focused on the livestock side of it, and it doesn't pick up the cropping side of it well. But when you look at the statistics from a crop point of view, we're about 20 to 25% now, if you like, fed income cropping in this part of the world, in Southwest Victoria, through this part, not going up into the Wimmera, but more sort of heading in that south phase. I remember when I started, and when groups like Southern Farming Systems started, about the only crop we grew were a few oats that you could put in the silo to feed your sheep. This is a big change. About a quarter of our land now is that we're using in dedicated cropping and cropping systems. Okay? It's changed the way we think about our systems. So we've changed not only the livestock that we run on it, but also change the enterprise that we run. So putting those two together, there's been a big shift in the way we need to have to manage things and the skills that we need to be able to do that and do that well. All right, I'd like to move on now to another thing when I was writing down these dot points of what do I think changed. So one was around that enterprise mix and who delivers the technologies and services. Another one is what technology have we actually got out there. And I'm going to name a few, but I'm sure there are other ones that you can probably think of as well. The first one is that we've made a big change as far as the species that we've got available. And I think the performance and the quality and the quantity of those species. And so the trial work that's gone on in the last 40 years, and I'll put them up as what I call my white peg trials, so small plot trials, have been really, really useful in breeding and testing better varieties. And I know PPS has done a lot of work in this sort of space to find those right species, to understand those performances. Focus very heavily on quality and quantity, so how much grows and what their digestibility is. I think if anything, we've probably been a little bit slack on understanding the persistence of them, because I think for a lot of farmers, the persistence side of it is super important. But we've also changed some other things, disease and pest resistance, endophyte type stuff. When I was looking at my early notes and see if any of these cultivars spring to mind. Trichala subclover was the subclover you sowed. It was Victorian perennial ryegrass. It was Demeter tall fescue, and it was curry cocksfoot. Any of those names ring a bell to you? I wonder how many people would plant them now. Okay. We've moved quite substantially. And we've taken some of the characteristics out of them that probably weren't the fanciest characteristics to have. And we've now got, I think, a better selection and a better opportunity to match the species with the types of systems we're wanting to run and the environment we're trying to grow them in. Second one, which is relatively new, it's certainly been big in cropping. I think it will have a bigger place in livestock as we go through, is this idea of variable rate. We've only just started using variable rate for our liming at home. We've looked into doing this for our fertiliser. Can't quite get the numbers to stack up at the moment like the croppers can, but I think this is going to be a bit of technology that in the future will improve our efficiency, particularly as some of those input costs become higher and higher, that we'll actually be able to map this better and with the variable rate equipment that we've got around, be more precise in what we put on and where we put it. The third one, which has still got a bit of work to go, but I think is actually quite exciting, is this satellite pasture monitoring. A little bit more challenging in the southern Australia than northern Australia. It works reasonably well there. But this high resolution, that's our place at home, that's 7 metre pixels, 7 metre squares of satellite. Our satellites, 2 satellites that fly over us, we get every 3 days, this imagery of quantities in different paddocks. Calibration's not all that great, and cloud's a bit of a bugger, because if it's cloudy, you don't actually get images coming through. But I wanted to put this up more so about some of the technologies now that we wouldn't have had 20 or 30 years ago. You can now get on your phone. I could stand here now and I could dial that up, and so we can start to understand what's growing where, how much have we got, how fast is it growing. That's a really big change and a really useful bit of information, if it's accurate, to help in our management decisions. Some other technology, soil moisture probe, soil temperature, really important one. Okay, and I'll show you in a tick the reason why when we start to look at what pasture we can actually grow. But this idea of having real time on your phone, how much moisture is in the ground and how warm is that soil, when we know they're the 2 drivers of leaf emergence, is just a massive change. I don't think we quite use it to the extent that we probably do need to use it in our forward predictions, but we've certainly got some technology there that we never had before. We've got other stuff, such as being able to locate where animals are. You do all this on your phone. This is Mobile that we use at home, but there are lots of other systems here. Beauty about this is that not only do you know how many animals you've got in a paddock and where they are, but it does all these calculations. So at the end of 12 months, I can work out which paddocks are actually running more stock and being able to carry more stock than others in our rotations. And so you can start to focus on which are the high producing paddocks and which are the ones that are lesser producing. Okay? Gives us a fantastic opportunity to be able to understand our system and refine our system better, and the grazing days and so on that you can get from them. Got some of this stuff. Anybody got OptiWays? Yeah, a few people got OptiWays. Oh, we've got one of these at home. We've got others on order. I reckon this is going to be the most fantastic bit of gear that is going to change the way we think. This is our next step in grazing management, and I'll tell you the reason why. So for people that aren't familiar with it, you just run this out in the paddock. It's got a satellite or a phone coverage, so every day you get an upload. The animals walk into it, they put their front feet on it, and that gives you a measurement of their weight, and it also reads their ear tag, so you can understand individual animals over time and how they're performing. We started playing around with this a couple of years ago, and what we realised is that when you put, in this case here, steers in a paddock that were growing, pop them in a paddock, got a fair bit of feed in front of them. The first 5, 6, 7 days, they're growing about 1.5 kilos a day. Day 8, they drop off to 1 kilo a day. Day 9, they drop off to 0.5 kilo a day. Day 10, they're not doing anything. That's the day we traditionally would have moved them. Okay? We've now changed that around and said, hang on, they keep dropping off. If these are animals that are going to make us dollars, we want to grow them as fast as possible. And so we then changed our system so that as soon as that started tapering off, we would move the steers to another paddock, and would have a mob of wethers come around for the last few days and clean that paddock up to the way we wanted it so it would regrow evenly next time. I never would have thought that I would run a system where I've got high value steers running followed by a group of wethers, mob of wethers. Okay. What we're able to do by doing those moves just 3 days earlier in every paddock over a 4-month period is we turn these fellas off 6 weeks earlier. Got some pen space. We sell to the long-fed Japanese market, so they go into feedlot for 270, 300 days up in Queensland. We could turn them off 6 weeks earlier, and they offered us an extra 50 cents a kilo for them because they had empty pen space because no one had animals at that time. Paid for our OptiWay just in 1 year. This sort of technology that's starting to come along, I think, is super exciting. We've got other things related to this as well. There's been some work on herbicides. Now, I reckon most people are familiar with what I'd call the big three: spray grazing, spray topping, winter cleaning. They're the sort of staples, and they've been around for decades and decades. But we have got some more flexibility now with some of the selective herbicides that we can use in our pastures to help with weed control. There are some tricks to get the best value out of them, but we certainly do have some more than what we used to have 30 years ago. Certainly become really good at this, unfortunately by some of the circumstances that we've had to deal with. But I reckon the way we containment feed now, compared to what we used to do 30 years ago, it's just chalk and cheese. 30 years ago, you just flog your paddocks. Yeah, we don't do that now. We've recognised that those paddocks need to be nursed through when they're under stress, and particularly when you put multiple stresses on them, that those pastures do need that period of no animals grazing them. And so our containment feeding work, I think, has gone through the roof in the last 5 to 10 years. And some of the containment facilities that I see now and some of the triggers that people are using to move them in containment early is absolutely fantastic. It's maintaining and helping us retain that pasture base so that it bounces back when things are good again. We've also got stock handling stuff. This again is a game changer. There's just a couple of pics from ours at home. But the idea of auto clamping, auto weighing, both with sheep and cattle, I think gives enormous opportunity. This stuff that we've got here on the right-hand side with the cattle, you don't even need to be near the crush to weigh them and draft them because it's all got laser beams and these gates open and shut by themselves. You can be 20 metres away from it, just pushing them up at the back, and it does all that for you. Your ability to have greater control over those animals and be able to read individual animals and know their performance and collect that is a game changer from where we were. I remember the old days of the box crate that you'd have to push a sheep into and then you'd have to read the weight and write it down. It's very different now. EIDs go with that as well. The cattle one we started on many years ago, so there's we're sort of quite comfortable with that. The sheep one, I think, has still got great potential. But the actual technology, if you think about it, there's a little chip in that plastic thing and you can wave a wand around and you can actually, or can go past a sensor and pick that up and read that and tell you a lot about that animal. And if you've got the history of that animal, you can learn a lot about the productivity of it and therefore your selection you can put on. And I imagine that Mark and Elke are going to sort of touch on the opportunity of being able to do this and use this. That's a game changer. We've gone from mob thinking to individual animal thinking within a mob. Big change. And then you can do a whole lot of genetic selection stuff, both whether it's ASBVs or EBVs or whether it's flock profiling using genomics and stuff like that. But that ability to be able to think more about the individual animal and what you've actually got and try and collectively select animals or keep animals that are doing the sort of things you want them to do and get rid of the ones that aren't. We just used to be mob stuff before. And what did you cull? You culled on age. Or culled on something that looked bloody awful that everybody could pick. We can do much, much better now and we can learn a lot from that. And so our opportunity with productivity is huge. So we've got a whole lot of technology stuff that's changed over the 40 years. Now, some of this is new or some of it is emerging. A lot of it is just second nature that we do now. But it was very different 30, 40 years ago. I wanted to move on to talk about pasture growth and climate, because this is one area that I think we're starting to get a better handle on now, and historically we haven't been very good at conveying and talking about this information. People familiar with a graph like this? Okay, it's pasture growth up here in kilograms per hectare per day. It's the 12 months of the year, and that's the average pasture growth rate. Okay, daily pasture growth rate. Everybody would have seen them. Okay, we've lived off that. We've tried to do a whole lot of decision making and calculations on that. I reckon that's useless. We can do much, much better and we understand much, much more now about what we've actually got. So I want to present some information to you which is going to tie back to some of the early stuff I'm talking about with the technology. So I want to talk about a thing called box and whisker graphs as a different way of presenting that same information to you, because I think it changes the way we need to think about how we set up our farming system and our stocking rate and the things we do. So what I've got up here is 16 years of pasture growth. Now, it doesn't matter where this is from. So this is pasture growth in November in kilograms per hectare. That should be kilograms per hectare per day. Sorry, I should change that. From 2004 to 2020. Okay, so there's 16 years of data there. And typically what we've done is I would have added up averaged those 16 years of data and said that we've got an average of 64 kilograms per hectare per day. But if you look at those numbers, there's no 64 in there. In fact, we don't get the average, but we get a lot of things apart from the average. But the information we've been using, or that you've been presented with, is just the average. So we can do a bit differently on that. Just clickers. Trouble. Okay, so what we can do is take that same information and represent it in a different way. So instead of hiding the volatility or the range that's in there and just giving you the average, we actually give you a range. And so in this case here, all I've done is take those numbers and I've put them here. So this one here, which is the lowest, which is 8 kilograms a hectare a day in 2006, that's that dot there. The highest one here is about 130 odd, so that would have been 2007. And all I've done is just stack them up in order. So same information, just rearranged in order. Okay? And then we can do a few things. We can put the average on it and we represent that with an X. We can put a thing called the median on it. And the median's just a line where half the dots, in this case 8 of the dots are above the line and 8 of the dots are below the line. We can also put a line in there where 75% of the dots or 3/4 of the dots are above the line, so the 12 dots above the line, 4 below. And we can do the same at the top, where 4 is above, 12 is below. Okay? And we can put lines at the top and the bottom as well. And then we can tidy them up, we can put some lines there, and so that's what we call the box bit of it, which represents 50% of the results are inside that box. And then we put whiskers on it, or tails on it, which are the 25% of those. Okay. Occasionally we'll see this thing called an outlier, and that's when one of the results is so far out of the basic range that you've got here that if I put that in as a tail, it'd give you a false impression of the range up here, so it'll stick out as a real odd one. And we can tidy this up, and so it'll look like that, and we can get rid of the dots, and it'll look like that. So we'll get this, what we call a box and whisker. That's what the box and whisker graph looks like for Ararat, for a subclover, perennial pasture, bit of cape weed, bit of annual ryegrass in it. Okay. With fertility at about 90%. So that's about an Olsen pea, if you like, around about that 12 to sort of 14 mark, 12, 13 mark. Okay. So each month, and so what's represented here is the box and whisker. Okay. And there's a few things you notice. What's something that jumps out at you when you look at that graph? Anything? Okay, sorry, Ken? Yeah, less range in winter. Okay, so if you look at Ararat here, then here in June and July, 50% of the results are going to be somewhere between 18 kilos a hectare a day, and what's that? Be about 12. So the variability or the volatility is nowhere near as great. Look at October and November. You can go anywhere between growing nothing in October and growing nothing in November to growing that. So I think what we're learning, and this started to come out of the Grain and Graze program, is that the average is pretty meaningless. The average, that line I showed you before, are just, if I joined up all of these X's, which are the averages in the middle. We learn a lot more by understanding this range and this volatility. And we can learn a lot about what risk is associated here, and in particular, because we know our grazing management and what's required. If I'm getting results like this, my grazing management needs to be very different than if I'm up here. Now, how do we know whether we're likely to be down here or up here? Two things are going to drive that if we've got our fertility right, and that's our soil moisture and our soil temperature, because they drive our leaf emergence. Okay, how quickly those leaves come out. So if we get a warm winter, we're likely to be at this end, because in here it is temperature, that's the main thing that's driving it, and in here it's about moisture and not temperature that drives it. Tie together those soil moisture probes, tie together an understanding of temperature, and we can then start to have a pretty good stab at where do you think we're going to be on this graph. So the average isn't what we use for our decision making, it is a tying together of a few bits of information that we've got to give us a much greater opportunity to make the right choices or make the right decisions. Now, if I'd put different species in here, the pattern would be different. If I had lucerne up there, the pattern would be different. Being able to understand the pattern and the variability of that is going to be really important, I think, going forward in getting our mix right. We know the species, we've just got to try and match them. And then in particular, if this is the way our performance is, matching that to things like our stocking rate and some of our key timing of operations of things like lambing and calving. Okay? Because if you know those sort of things, you can start to look at that. And a case in point was, if I look at this graph here, from 2020 to 2023, and it wasn't in Ararat, it was at Hamilton, we had 4 years, why doesn't this thing work? We had 4 years in a row where our autumn, our March and April in particular, was sitting in the top bit of this whisker. Had it in 2020, had it in 2021, had it in 2022, had it in 2023. When you look at that whisker is telling you that this is, if you like, 1 year in 4, so only 25% of the results historically have been up here. We snagged them 4 years in a row. The chances of snagging it a 5th time in a row were very low. In fact, snagging them 4 years in a row, I went back to 100 years of running this model, we never had 4 years in a row like that. But what happened, some people thought, oh, our autumns are pretty good, we'll sneak our lambing forward a bit. 2025, we had this. 2024, we had this. And 2025, we've had this. And so we've had 2 really, really tough years of having to lamb down with bugger all feed. Now, if you look back in history, the odds of us snagging another really good year up here would be minimal. If you just looked at the average, you think you'd be able to get away with it. If you look at this, it gives you a whole new complexion on the way we need to think about our pasture systems and how we put them together. So this is one of my forward-thinking bits in the 40 years. I reckon this is year 40 to year 50 in my career is going to be working in this space. You can represent that different ways. I've just put the seasons together, but again, you can see the variability. Don't expect to grow feed in summer. Okay, it doesn't grow in summer. Okay, in that January, February period, occasionally we get these big summer thunderstorms and stuff grows, but in most cases it doesn't. This is quite steady. This is highly variable, and our management's got to adapt accordingly to what's thrown at us month on month. Okay. So we're going to get, I think, a different level of management that we need to apply. This is just representing another way, and I wanted to bring this one in because I want to talk a little bit about the climate side of it and what's changed over the 40 years. So I've cast back to 1970, so this is the exact same information that I was showing you before, but instead of taking all the Januaries and sticking them together in a box and whisker graph, I've taken 1970 and put it together. 1970 and put it together, okay? So the blue represents autumn, and it's a little bit hard to see, I think, on the screen there. The orange represents that winter period, which is fairly stable, and that's why all the bars are about the same length. You've got the green ones, which are spring, which are hugely different, you know. That's how much we got this spring, that's how much we got this spring. Hugely different, and then the yellow representing that bit of a summer period in there. Okay. The reason why I wanted to put that up is that when I ran this model, it was on the basis of good species, good fertility, so the new varieties that we've got at the moment. And I stuck this and ran this model saying, if I had those really good new varieties that we're using now in the model and had them in 1970 and got the climatic conditions in 1970 that they're growing in now, how would they perform? That's what it looks like. If you do a regression on that, look at it, there's actually a downward slope. In other words, we've grown more feed in the 1970s with those, would have grown more feed in the 1970s with those new varieties than what we're growing now. And the reason why, when you pull that apart, is our autumn breaks are getting later. Not every year, but some years are getting later. And that real productive shoulder that we used to get in springtime, in that late spring period, we're losing some of them. It matches with the discussion that people are saying this is the way the climate is actually changing in this part of the world. Now, I don't want to get into a debate, is climate change real and all that sort of stuff, but if you just look at that sort of modelling and that sort of discussion, we are being challenged by how much feed we can grow because our pattern of the climate has changed, and this is just one bit of evidence of what sort of impact that's having. So that's about 1,000 kilos a hectare decline over that period of time. Still got huge volatility from year to year, okay, and that actually overrides what, if you like, is the underlying change that I see that's happening over the last 4 decades of the way the environment's allowing us to grow feed if we wanted to grow it. All right, so let's just tie all that together. First of all, what's it mean from a cost and income point of view? And this won't be any different. I'm sure we've all experienced this, is that when I went back to the Southwest Monitor Farm, this is what our pasture costs have been back to 1996, 97. So last 30 years. A few gaps in there when the Monitor Farm didn't do or didn't collect the data. This has been adjusted for inflation. Okay? So for a long period, our pasture costs around here were around about that 60 to 70, maybe up to $80 dollars a hectare is what we were spending on our pastures. The green line represents our total pasture costs, the red one representing our fertiliser and lime and maybe a bit of gypsum that we'd spent. Okay? So we're ticking along around about that with most of that money going into fertiliser. That started to separate out a bit, but the biggest change is that we're having to spend a lot more money, or we are spending a lot more money now on our fertiliser, on our pastures, than what we did 30 years ago. Everybody will recognise that. Our costs have gone up is a simple way of looking at it. What's interesting though is that that's how our income's tracked. So this is gross income with the same data set. So our costs have gone up, But you could argue that our income, even though it bounces around a bit, our income has gone up compared to where it was before. Again, adjusted for inflation. So we're getting paid a little bit more for it, but our costs have gone up as well. When you put those two together, that's what our profit looks like. Now that's what's called EBIT, so that's earning before interest and tax. So that line there represents zero. Anything below that means that you've made a loss, and this is a profit, but that's profit before you've had to pay the tax man, if you've got tax that you've got to pay, or any interest if you've got loans out that you need to pay interest on. So it's bounced around quite a bit, but it certainly hasn't gone up. So the increase in costs and our increase in income has basically cancelled each other out over that period of time. All right, last couple of things. I don't know how I'm tracking for time. Craig is gone, so... Yeah, got a few more minutes still? Yep. All right. Okay, I want to just touch on two other things that I've seen that are major differences. One is around community expectation. And I've seen a huge difference that now consumers want their food and fibre to be produced, first of all, ethically. So animal welfare stuff, when I reflect on what the expectations now of animal welfare are, things of the way we treat animals, things like pain relief and stuff like that we use, and the treatments of them, put mulesing in as part of sort of that, compared to where we were 40 years ago, is very different. There's a much higher expectation that it's produced ethically. Also that it's produced without harming the environment. Okay, so this idea, when the erosion, I started off and there was a big thing called the Victorian Salinity Program because of rising water tables and salinity because of land clearing, loss of vegetation, loss of biodiversity, erosion, those sort of things that were occurring. Yeah. We're now expected to do this without having any impact on the environment, if anything, enhancing the environment, and we're expected to do it sustainably or regeneratively, whatever that means to you. Okay, that's a new buzzy word at the moment, but that idea is that we can keep doing this and we're actually improving the system rather than degrading the system. That's the expectation. And I reckon if I went back 40 years ago, apart from the one about we've got to do something to fix up the environment because we've buggered it, none of the other ones were actually on the radar, but they are now, and they're quite strongly on the radar. But we have made, I think, significant improvements to address the past impacts. Whether it's soils, whether it's habitat loss, whether it's vegetation and so on. In fact, I look at a lot of the land care work that's been done and that has been a major reversal of the direction we were going into where we're sitting now. I want to pick up this last one though, because it's a point that, and I think Craig described it as I was a leader in this carbon space or emission space. It's by default, not necessarily by choice. And by that I mean that a lot of people are asking questions about where this is going, and a lot of it is being driven from beyond the farmers are looking at, but we're going to be impacted by that expectation. When I went through uni, I remember writing notes about a thing called the glasshouse effect in the 1980s. And that was this thing where there's more gases getting up in the atmosphere and it's going to act like a glasshouse and things are going to warm up. And that's about as much as I reckon it was probably a 10-minute talk in a lecture. And then it was, yeah, whatever, and we moved on to other stuff. Okay, that's where it was. It's very different to where we are now. Because you go to the 2020s now, and these words like international agreements, where 195 countries around the world have got together and said we've got to do something about this. And we have things like the Kyoto Protocol that some people may have heard of, which bound countries to actually record each year what the emissions are from their countries and do it in a standardised way and present that to the rest of the world. This is how we're tracking. Australia does it every year. We have done it for the last 15, 16 years now. And you can see where agriculture fits in that and how agriculture's emissions are changing over that time. We put that out for the rest of the world. One called the Paris Agreement that Donald Trump just pulled out of. The Liberal Nationals at the moment are arguing whether we should have this. This is all part of the Paris Agreement, which was this commitment to be net zero by 2050. Not going to go into whether that's a good target to go for or not, But these things weren't even on the agenda. Okay, and in the last few years, 2021, there was this Glasgow Agreement. Scott Morrison was Prime Minister at the time, to give you a time frame on that. That's how we came up with this 2030 target of reducing Australia's emissions by 43% from 2004-5 by 2030. So these phrases, these words that are around have, if you like, progressed over the last 40 years. And they are actually affecting us now. These targets that are being set, the expectations that are being set, has implications for what we do in agriculture. There's also, particularly in the last decade, a huge increase in what I call the supply chain demands. I could go back 15, 20 years and it was all government driven. The next 10 years is all going to be supply chain driven because of the implications that are on them, and most recently implications in the finance sector. There are what are now called these mandatory financial disclosures. This is happening all around the world. Australia's got to do it as well. And so the big companies that are buying your products have to disclose what emissions are associated with their operation. And so if they're an operation like a supermarket that are buying your products and the emissions associated with those as they go through their supply chain and they have to report, will be reporting on what you're doing. And I can see very clearly over time that they will be wanting to buy from people that are lower emitters than ones that are higher emitters, because they have an obligation to make their numbers go lower. And if 60, 70, 80% of their emissions are associated with who they buy from, it is going to affect us. It's going to affect us. And so this idea of greenhouse gas calculations, emissions, understanding this thing called sequestration, how much stuff can we capture and put on farms, whether it's in trees or soils, and importantly this description at the moment that the supply chain's really buzzing around, which is emissions intensity. How efficiently can you produce a kilo of beef, kilo of wool, tonne of grain? Okay. And they will selectively start buying from people that are lower than the ones that are higher. This is going to be unavoidable. Whether we like it or not, this is going to be part of it. At the moment, they're using default values. Very soon, they will have an expectation that you will have a number and we will differentiate on that. I've got no doubt about that. But where does Australian agriculture sit in all of this? So you could think about what I've been saying there and going, there's another impost on farming. This is just another job we've got to do. This is going to cost us a lot. I want to put it in a bigger and a wider context. First of all, we put in 16% of Australia's total emissions. So when Australia does their annual calculations, we're the second biggest sector and we're about 16% of all the emissions. Last year was about 18%, but it's around about that, just under 20% of Australia's emissions. But it's not carbon dioxide that we deal with. We actually use carbon dioxide in a big cycle, as people probably know. It's in the atmosphere, it goes into the plant, that either then goes into grain that we eat or meat that we eat. And then as we eat it, we respire it back as carbon dioxide and it goes around in a big circle. There is a bit of an issue with ruminants eating that and turning some of it into methane, which has got a higher warming until it breaks down to carbon dioxide again, and that's why the livestock industry gets pinged. But it's not carbon dioxide that we're dealing with. It's actually two other gases, methane and nitrous oxide, which comes from nitrogen fertiliser in particular. But we export 70% of our products. And as the rest of the world starts wanting and demanding lower emissions products, if we want to sell our stuff to the rest of the world, we're going to have to get on board. The really good news is when I've been doing calculations, and a number of other consultants that have been doing this sort of stuff, and we've been looking at pretty good operations and how they're tracking and how they compare in their numbers, their emissions numbers and emissions intensity numbers compared to everybody else around the globe, we're one of the lowest. Okay. So Australian agriculture in general, and particular individual farmers who've been working in general, are lower than virtually anywhere else in the world. For our meat production, for our wool production, for our milk production, for our grain production. It's actually an advantage if we think of it in a positive way rather than an impost way. So my plea to you is don't be shy on that sort of stuff because, in fact, I think it's an opportunity compared to a lot of the inefficient ones around the rest of the world. And the biggest single driver, if you want to lower your emissions, is growing heaps of this stuff. Nothing changes your emissions calculations more in the positive than being able to turn off animals quickly and produce lots of them. And what's the engine room behind all of this? Is good, high quality pasture and lots of it. If you can produce this, then that whole emissions stuff looks after itself. So I say to a lot of the clients when we've done these numbers, they say, well, what can I do to make it lower? I just go back to our pastures and I go back to our livestock. Let's keep driving them to make them as efficient and productive as possible. Got to squeeze more out of them. We've now got technologies, as I was starting to show you, that allow us to do that if we can get our heads around it. We can make better decisions around that if we understand volatility of pasture growth and how we're tracking. So I'd suggest to you, while that's certainly something that we will have to deal with, the challenge of it isn't anywhere near as great. In fact, I see it as an enormous opportunity if we're clever enough. So just to finish off, how far have we come? And Rob and I had a discussion about this and Robert wrote me some notes. A couple of points I want to make. Today's best practice is yesterday's innovation. What we're doing and we think we're doing well, in fact, was an innovation 20, 30 years ago. That new stuff that I showed you, some of that opportunity now, I reckon in 10, 20 years' time, it'll just be part of normal practice and what we do. We can all farm well in good years. And I've seen a number of farms that I don't think are operating very well, but still do it right when seasons are good and favourable to you and prices are good. You can still turn a profit, and you can turn a good profit and you think the job's ticking along right. Where I reckon is the real test, is how well we're set up when we get into these tough periods, into these drought periods. Can anybody remember that? Yeah, a few people can, yeah. I was at an orientation day at Melbourne Uni because we're going to Derrimut the next year. And this was in Feb 1983. This was O'Malley visiting Melbourne. Yeah? And that was in the drought period. And I remember the sky, it was like an apocalypse. In the middle of Melbourne, they're here in Parkville, just watching this stuff roll in. It was just mind-blowing, okay? And so I think when I look at a test, and this is what Rob and I were talking about, one of the tests is if you want to see how far we've come, let's contrast a couple of those. So the 83 drought, the latest one that we've been challenged with. Big changes. We've introduced and successfully managed a more robust feed base with our perennial grasses in conjunction with annuals and niche species. Our feed base is very, very different. When I started doing my early land care work at a group called the Wodialek Catchment Group, and we ran for 25 years, and we got quite a lot of money from Alcoa. The number one priority in 93 93 when we started was to get perennials in. Because in the last drought, you couldn't see some of the fence lines. This is just south of Ballarat. Couldn't see the fence lines because of the amount of dirt that had blown up and the soil that had blown up on those. The drought that we had during that period, in that 25 years, none of the paddocks moved. That is a fantastic achievement. We've changed that whole system. And this perennial base and manage this perennial base is super important. Not only that, we've learned how to protect it when it's under stress. And we've managed our ground cover. So we've got much better with the feed budgeting, containment feeding, all of those sort of things. Innovations 20, 30 years ago, common practice now. We've also learned how to feed animals, and I think Elke and Ferg are going to sort of cover this sort of stuff about our animal side of the production system. But it hasn't just been pastures, it's been pastures and how we've put our animals together as well. Second last one is that we've bred better animals. I don't reckon if you went back and looked at an animal from 40 years ago to an animal now, that you'd recognise the two. They are significantly different in the type of animal that we're running. And the last one is around our farm management and our decision making. And we are getting much better at this. at being able to make earlier decisions to either sell stock or putting them in containment. So our management, our ability to not leave them there and not make a decision, but actually do make a decision based on the way things are changing, I see is very, very different. Still got opportunity to do better in that space, but certainly we've made a big change. And on that basis, Lockie, I think it is, I might pull up there. Yep, that's it, I'm done.
Well done, Cam. Thanks a lot for that. That talks a lot of information in there and a lot of sort of new things, old things, future things that we all take a lot of value. And look, I think in the interest of time, we might have time for one quick question if anyone's got a burning question. All good? All good. Is that one back there? No.
Just one, that was terrific, awesome talk. Can you just explain your efficiency effects on emissions? So you made a statement growing more feed and turning off more livestock. In what part of that, is it the ratio, we still have the same emissions or slightly higher, but the more product we're turning off, that's making the emissions smaller? How does that work?
Yeah, so at this point in time, and I did jump over that very quickly, at this point in time the supply chain are focused on this thing called emissions intensity. Okay, so it's not the total emissions from your farm that they're focused on how efficiently you can turn a product off. And we think about things like, what do we turn off per 100 mil of rainfall, or what stocking rate do we have per 100 mil of rainfall? It's the same sort of metric. Because they realise they're pragmatic enough to know if they said we're only going to buy from farmers that are carbon neutral or emissions neutral, not going to be able to buy anything, they'll go bust. Okay? But what they are realising is that there's a range in how efficiently people turn that off. So if you can produce the same quantity but turn those animals off 2 months, 3 months earlier, if you've got females and you can get more females with twins and singles and therefore get more lambs on the ground and therefore more product for... Your emissions may go up slightly, your productivity, your production goes up much more, your emissions intensity goes down. And so that feed is the engine room of growing them fast, getting them pregnant, getting them ovulating. So A, they hit puberty, B, they have more twins and singles if you talk about sheep, or if it's cattle, making sure as many of them get pregnant as possible, and then making them grow. Those steers that we turned off 6 weeks earlier reduced our emissions. Okay, and our emissions intensity number went down. That was great for us, we made more money out of it, much more productive, but it also lowered that number. Ultimately, to get to this lower neutrality state, okay, and if you look at some of the international reports, they're not expecting agriculture to be zero emissions, even though that's constantly bandied around. Okay, agriculture's not, we've got to feed people, population's going to grow, but we're going to have to be significantly lower than where we are now. And so to do that, it's going to be very much productivity based in the early stages, and then some of these other technologies that will come in. And those technologies in the livestock sector are things like we can genetically select for animals that produce less methane eating the same amount of feed. There are different types of fodders that animals eat that makes them produce less methane because they have tannins and oils in them. So they'll come in over time. And help us. There'll be dietary supplements or there'll be vaccines or things like that that will help change the way the rumen works. But I'd suggest in the next 5 or 10 years, if our focus is grow as much feed as you can and be as productive as possible, you will end up with the lowest numbers.
That's given that obviously maintenance is your highest component of that.
Yeah. So you've got your maintenance. So what do you top up on maintenance? If you grow them, you grow those lambs at 200 grams a day, or grow them at 350 and turn them off earlier, that will show up in your number. That will show up in your productivity in your number.
Very good. Thanks, Cam. I know, probably 19 years ago when you lectured me back at uni, you had a wealth of knowledge back then and continue to grow, and I think everyone appreciates that. And Cam's here all day, so feel free to use and abuse the information that he's got. But everyone put your hands together again for Cam Newton. Thanks, Cam.
I love it.
Appreciate it.